Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 281. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, August the 20th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Today's podcast, today's essay, is kind of going off of last week's podcast just a little bit. Not the podcast per se. I mean, the podcast last week was about cattle mutilations, and that's not what this podcast is about. However, one of the stories that I talked about, the news of the day type stories before we got into the essay about cattle mutilations, had to do with a phenomenon, a buzzword, whatever you would call it, referred to as quiet quitting. And it's not what you might think, or maybe it is exactly what you might think, but it's one of the new ways in which the younger workforce is approaching their job, their work ethic. And quiet quitting basically is, yeah, you're not quitting your job, but you kind of are. You're cutting back. You're not doing everything the man says. Maybe you're just doing the minimum that you can and without getting fired, but you're still hanging around for the paycheck. And quiet quitting kind of says something about the new work ethic in this country. I'm going to go into great detail over quiet quitting and the new work ethic that we have in this country. It's not to say that it's good. It's not to say that it's bad. It's not going to say that it's detrimental. It's not going to say that it's going to help or hurt our economy, our way of life, our productivity as a country moving forward. But it's a fact. It's here. I'm going to give you the facts, and then you can decide whether or not it's going to be a good thing or not. But before we get into quiet quitting and the new work ethic in the country, this is not going to be a hack job on the United States, on young people, on our work ethic. It's just going to be information that you can listen to and use and come to your own decision. But before you do that, and if you think that I'm criticizing the way things work in this country, I want to tell you another story of something that happened this week. Not here, but in China. And to all those that think, well, this country's not what it used to be. It's not good. It's not bad. We'd be better off if we did this or this or that. Here's what you need to consider. There's a Chinese, actually he's a Canadian-Chinese citizen, dual citizenship, a billionaire. His name is Zhao Jinhu. Ever heard of him? Of course you haven't. Well, maybe you have. But I'm going to tell you about him. He's a Chinese-Canadian multi-billionaire, okay? And you may not have heard of him because he's not been in the news at all for the last 5 years. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison by a Shanghai court. He did plead guilty to charges including graft and illegal handling of funds. But how did he get to that court? Well, he was abducted from his Hong Kong home 5 years ago. Mr. Zhao used the company he founded, Tomorrow Group, to pay bribes to unnamed government officials totaling around $100 million for over 20 years. That's according to a statement from the Shanghai number 1 People's Court yesterday, Friday, the 19th. It said that Mr. Zhao used companies he controlled to illegally collect more than $45 billion in public deposits. Now, in China, just like this country, you can't bribe public officials for your own business benefit, okay? So the purpose of this is to not say, well, this Mr. Zhao, he's totally innocent. I don't know that. But it's how the Chinese courts brought him to court and how they tried him that I want to just point out to you, dear listeners. Mr. Zhao couldn't be reached for comment. Of course he couldn't. Mr. Zhao's relatives didn't immediately respond to a request from comment either. Okay. Of course they didn't, because human smugglers removed Mr. Zhao from Hong Kong's Four Seasons Hotel. That's where he lived. in a serviced apartment, and they sprinted him off to mainland China back in 2017. That was before the big crackdown in Hong Kong. They had the one country, two systems government set up there once upon a time. So he couldn't get a trial the way they wanted to in Hong Kong, so they kidnapped him and brought him to the mainland, okay? Now, before his disappearance, Mr. Zhao controlled a sprawling business empire covering sectors ranging from insurance to beet farming and just about everything in between. He was also known for having business connections with Beijing's political elite, so he was definitely in bed with these people. Now, the court said Mr. Zhao's sentence was reduced in part because he turned himself in. No, he didn't. He was kidnapped. The court also showed contrition, and he helped authorities mitigate losses after 5 years in solitary confinement. Mr. Zhao faced trial back in July after spending years being held in solitary confinement. Neither relatives nor Canadian diplomats, because this guy has dual citizenship, were granted access to the trial. Now, the Canadian embassy in Beijing didn't immediately respond for a request for comment either. This story, by the way, is out of the Wall Street Journal. The business empire of Mr. Zhao was estimated to be worth $5 billion around the time of his disappearance. It's been dismantled by the Chinese authorities. Dismantled means seized and taken. In 2020, financial regulators in Beijing said that they had taken over four insurers, 2 trust firms, 2 securities firms, and a futures company that together were valued at hundreds of billions of dollars. Hundreds of billions of dollars these firms were worth, and the government just seized them. Now, the 50-year-old Mr. Zhao is among a number of high-profile Chinese businessmen targeted under Chinese leader Xi Jinping's wide-ranging anti-corruption campaign. His abduction, which came a week after sentencing of a star Chinese stock fund manager for manipulation, sparked fears in the country's financial sector of a political reckoning. Okay, here's how China works, folks. And you may say, well, that's not a whole lot different than this country works. But hear me out before you make that decision, that statement. If you want to succeed in China, you have to work with the government. And what happens over there is you work with the government, okay? And if you become too powerful, if you don't do exactly what they say, they throw you in prison and they seize your assets. They did this to Mr. Zhao. They did this to Jack Ma. They did do this to everybody who does not play ball with them. Now, it's not the way it happens in this country. Sure, people lie, cheat, and steal in this country too. They bribe government officials in this country too. Often they're brought to trial, often they're not. Sometimes they're found guilty, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're found guilty of antitrust laws, sometimes they're not. But dear listeners, they are never taken from their homes, carted off, and put onto trial with nobody being able to be at the trial who's other than the government. That doesn't happen in this country. Mr. Putin and the Russians are no choir boys. But hear me out. Compared to the Chinese, we don't have anything to worry about when it comes to Russia. The Chinese are ruthless. They are, the ultimate end justifies the means. Now, when I say the Chinese, I don't mean the Chinese people. I mean the Chinese government. Mr. Xi, in this country, the big news here in this country is, well, Trump said he really didn't lose the election. He wanted to stay president. Mr. Xi did the same thing. He can't run for re-election in the Communist Party. But basically, he threw all his opposition in jail, most all of his opposition in jail, and basically told the ones who weren't thrown in jail, look, you're on my side or you go to jail. And Mr. Xi is basically president for life now. He is dictator of that country for life. I guess actually he's the head of the Communist Party, but the Communist Party is the only party and they rule the roost. That doesn't happen in this country. So are we perfect? No. Are we anything like China? No. Just remember that the next time you complain about the way things work in the USA. Let's get on to the essay. Quiet quitting. I talked about it a little bit last week. And it's something that, and it's not a millennial thing per se, it's more of a Gen Z thing, okay? The youngest of the youngest generation, those under 30. The service economy in this country, that's supposed to be where all the growth is. The service economy doesn't serve you, okay? They just don't. An example, I'm helping my father out. He's 86. He doesn't hear well. And I make his doctor's appointments for him and help him out with that. Well, his appointment was canceled this week. He went to it by himself. He's capable of that. But then called me and said, look, they canceled the appointment on me. I said, no, Dad, they didn't cancel the appointment. In fact, I just confirmed the appointment yesterday. But sure enough, they canceled the appointment. Never told him, never notified him, never let him know about it until he got there. And then sure enough, I looked on his My Mercy account and they had taken it off. And I had called them a day or two earlier because I said, look, during this appointment, I'd like for you to give him a written synopsis of the appointment because he has trouble hearing what you have to say. They never responded to me. You can't call the doctor's office and talk to an individual. You must communicate with them via the My Mercy text messaging, and then they don't respond to you. I had a personal business dealing this week. You call people 3 times, they promise they're going to call you back, and they just never do. In fact, when you call businesses, I called several businesses this week, they don't give you an option to talk to somebody. They just say, leave a message and we'll call you back. And they never do. I told you the story about the Chili's in the Milwaukee airport. You sit down, you have to scan the menu, order off of the menu, pay off of your phone. Oh, and by the way, and then leave a tip. Leave a tip. The people didn't do anything for you, okay? Work ethic in the United States is changing. It has changed. It's changed. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. I'm not going to say it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. I'm saying it's a changed thing, and that's something that no one can deny. Just attendance at work, okay? It's almost like people show up when they want to sometimes, and it's kind of acceptable. Now, I get that people have a personal life, and I'll use Major League Baseball as an example. The Cardinals closer, Ryan Helsley, okay, having a great year, ERA under 1. He's lights out as a closer. The Cardinals are in the middle of a pennant race. Mr. Helsley and his wife had a baby. He's going to be gone for the weekend. He's going to miss 3 games because he's caring for his child. Now, maybe that's a good thing that he takes a breath and spends time with his family. But back in the day, your wife had a baby. Congratulations, you've got games to close. It doesn't work that way anymore. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's just how things are. I've been in my current job for over 20 years. I've never missed a day, or I never had missed a day until I had the problems with my appendix a couple 3 years ago. Now, during 2 different sessions with my appendix going under the knife and everything's taken care of, I finally got it taken out, and I'm fine. But here's what happened when I had my appendix out, okay? I went to the hospital on Wednesday. I had my appendix taken out I went to the hospital on a Tuesday, had the appendix taken out on a Wednesday, went home on a Thursday, went to work on a Friday, left for vacation on Saturday. So I missed 3 days. The middle day, I went under the knife, okay? Things aren't that way anymore. I mean, and those were the first days I had missed in over 20 years at my workplace. Things just are different. My mother passed away several months ago, and we're trying to get all of her financials in order. Some of them were in dad's name, some were in mom's name. One of them was in mom's name. It was an annuity. They just did things that way. She had hers, he had his, and they were the beneficiary of each other's annuities. So if one of them died, the other one got it. So we're having to claim mom's annuities and put them into dad's name. One of these annuities actually was paying a pretty decent rate of return. So we didn't necessarily want to cash it in. We wanted to see how to roll it over. And you go online, you read, they really don't show you how to roll something over, okay? You can close it out and reopen it, but maybe it's easier to roll over. So I called them, the Great American Life Insurance Company. Okay, that's the name of the company. Big corporation. And they even said in the letter they sent, hey, if you have any questions, call this person at this number. I called that person at that number. They got her on the phone, told her what I wanted to do, and she went, yeah, I'm going to have to call you back. Never did. Called back again. She wasn't there that day, but they'd get somebody else to call me back. They never did. I cashed out the policy and put the money someplace else. Now, it was not a king's ransom, but it was 5 figures. It was a decent amount of money. And these people could not be bothered to tell me what I needed to do to keep my money at their firm. They didn't want to be bothered. That's how things have changed. That's how, and the bottom line is maybe they didn't want the money. Maybe that was chicken feed to them. I don't know. But I've done a lot of research this week on the whole new work ethic in this country, the whole quiet quitting movement. And golly, I researched a publication called Sumus Inc., the Saturday Evening Post, Forbes magazine, and the Wall Street Journal to come up with this information on how things are just changing. The first story is it's from a guy named Jordan Lampin, and he tells a story that was very interesting. This is in Samos Inc. It's a website. It's a company who has a website who tells stories about stuff like this. But Mr. Lampin says the whole thing starts out with, nobody wants to work anymore. You've all heard that, especially from people, the boomers and older, okay? Nobody wants to work anymore. Now, recently, this is Mr. Lampin speaking in the first person. Recently, this phase seems to comprise of almost every headline and every current right-wing piece of journalism, and it's thrown around in nearly every conversation amongst individuals tired of handing over a single chunk of their paycheck to Uncle Sam. This phrase also comes to fruition frequently during day-to-day life, especially when it comes to the service industry. For example, this weekend, again, Mr. Lampin speaking in the first person, this weekend I had plans to meet a friend for dinner in downtown Raleigh. As I walked to the restaurant where we were meeting, I passed a number of signs hanging on the doors of different restaurants and retail shops saying, please bear with us as we are understaffed. When I got to the restaurant, the hostess informed my friend and I that they too were understaffed because a few of her coworkers decided not to show up for work that night. As a result, our server was overwhelmed and the service was subpar. My experience this weekend led me to realize that the frequent use of the phrase, nobody wants to work anymore, is certainly justified. However, it also caused me to consider when it began that nobody wanted to work anymore and why it is that nobody wants to work anymore. This lack of willingness to work couldn't have just emerged, and it has to be more complicated than just the result of government subsidization. That was a telling couple of paragraphs, okay? And he's not wrong because I witnessed the same thing. I'm quite sure you have too. Now, there was a recent article published in Forbes magazine, and it points out that America's once had the strongest work ethic in the world. This strong work ethic has long been the defining character of the American people. A study from the Institute of Labor Economics back in 2017 found that Americans work 25% more hours, take less vacation time, and were retiring later relative to other workers throughout the world. Now today, 2022, data shows that the work ethic among many Americans has declined. In fact, according to data from CNBC, there are 11.3 million jobs available. But the employers are having a difficult time filling these vacancies. Why? Many people point to the pandemic as a reason for this decline. Now, COVID-19 was certainly a contributor to many individuals either quitting or losing their jobs. And this decline in work ethic was evident even prior to 2020. In fact, you could argue that it began about 10 years ago when the millennial generation entered the workforce. Now, a study from the Pew Research Center conducted way back in 2010, that's 13 years ago, 12 years ago, reported that the millennial generation, about 50 million people aged between 18 and 29, again, that was in 2010, is the only age group in the nation that do not cite work ethic as their principal claims to distinctiveness. In other words, they're not going to brag, I'm a hard worker. They really don't want to talk about that. Now, today's millennials and Gen Xers make up the large majority of the workforce. The characterization of many of these younger generations of being lazy is common among boomers and among boomers, okay? But these groups who've grown up in the contemporary era of digital technology likely have a different perspective and approach to employment. I mean, consider this. Millennials and individuals from Generation Z have unique priorities different from those of older generations, even Gen Xers, okay? Social media, innovative technology, liberal tolerance, all play a part. Additionally, consider that those in the job market are seeking atypical jobs in emerging industries like social media or even the gig economies that are compatible with their priorities. In other words, not 9 to 5, whenever you want. Now, the pandemic caused a year of forced unemployment where over 46 million Americans received at least 1 week pay. $749 billion were issued into weekly payments for people who weren't working. Now, during this time, many Americans were getting paid more to stay at home than they would have made working. However, the pandemic was twofold in its effect on the workforce. It made room for emerging industries like social media and the gig economy that millennials and the Gen Xers favor. Now, some people argue that an increase in wages would incentivize people to return to work and solve the labor shortage. That didn't happen. In fact, in an article in Wall Street Journal, the president of W.W. Cannon in Dallas, Texas, Greg Brown, said he was offering wages up to $30 an hour and still couldn't find people willing to come to work. Now, perhaps this is due in part to the financial cushion that many Americans have. The U.S. government spent millions of Americans, the U.S. government sent millions of Americans a stimulus check as part of the American Rescue Plan. That's according to a report from J.P. Morgan Chase. Yet, aside from the unemployment benefits and stimulus checks, one must wonder if offering $30 an hour and still having difficulty finding workers actually proves that there's been a shift away from manual labor and the service economy. Maybe that's what happened. Now, in other words, it doesn't matter what you pay. People don't want to do that kind of work. Now, while the current labor shortage is certainly a consequence of the checks from Uncle Sam, it may also be the result of a shift towards digitization. The pandemic forced widespread unemployment, but it also revealed how millennials and Gen Xers prefer to work, and that requires technology and digital media skills over physical and manual skills. Now, a discussion paper from McKinsey states that by 2030, the need for some skills like technological as well as social and emotional skills will rise, even as the demand for others, including physical and manual skills, will fall. These changes will require workers everywhere to deepen their existing skill sets or acquire new ones. But then that's nothing new. As a result, companies may find it more beneficial to restructure and rethink their corporate structures and approach to work and hiring, they can't just simply increase wages. They've got to change the way they recruit people and what they offer to people. Okay. Now, there's a lot of truth to that statement. And what's the old statement? This is the baby boomer statement. If nothing defines what baby boomers have stood for, this is the statement that they've always said, okay? In quotes, do what you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life. That's an old boomer adage, okay? Which for more than 99% of us, it's BS, okay? Because liking your job and loving what you do are two different things. They're not the same, okay? What do I mean by that? Here's an example. I love my wife. I don't get money for being around her, okay? And I'm not leaving her. But I like my job. Love my wife, like my job. I don't make money off my wife. I'm sticking around. I like my job. If they stop paying me, I'm gone tomorrow, friends. Okay? That's the difference between liking your job and loving your job. Very few people truly love their jobs. See the difference? Okay? Let's continue, shall we? Interesting article from the Saturday Evening Post. And what makes this interesting is not so much what it says, but when it was said. This is an old article. This is 4 years old, okay? Some of this is out of the Saturday Evening Post. Some of it is out of Forbes magazine. Actually, Saturday Evening Post quotes Forbes magazine, to be fair. And again, taken in context, this was written 4 years ago. See how things compare 4 years ago to just today. 4 years shouldn't be a lot of time. But the article goes on to say, it's easy to see that America has lost sight in the virtues that compromise work ethic, the very things that help build our country. Now, that's according to David Schwabel in Forbes magazine. It's a common complaint among Americans. You can hear it when we get lousy service in a restaurant. You can hear it when we find our appliance doesn't work when it gets home, or we spend hours on the telephone to speak to a customer service representative who can't or won't help us. We've all been there, friends. Now, they ask the question, have Americans lost their willingness to apply their noses to the grindstone or to work hard for anything that they get in life? That's a question. The answer, that's not exactly what the statistics show. In fact, right now, the average American works 34.2 hours a week. That's according to a 2018 Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But that includes part-time workers. Adult Americans, remember, this is from 2018. Adult Americans with full-time work average 47 hours a week, 90 minutes more than they worked a decade ago. That's according to a 2014 Gallup poll. We annually put in more hours on average than workers in most industries. 70 more hours a year than the Japanese, 99 more than the Brits, 424 more than the very efficient Germans, okay? That's according to the OECD study, okay? The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, in fact, European workers find it funny that Americans work from home, respond to work emails, phone calls after hours, eat lunch at their desk, or skip lunch altogether, and refuse to take paid vacations or sick leave. That's most of us, though, isn't it? I mean, I do all that with the exception of I've always taken my paid vacations or sick leave. Actually, that's not true because when I left a company over 20 years ago, I had a ton of unused vacation. I took the money instead of taking the time off. So maybe I'm just as guilty as everyone else when it comes to that. And in fact, European workers, we rack up an impressive number of hours because we still believe in the virtue of work, okay? 75% of American workers still believe that most people can succeed if they work hard. 57% in the UK, 35% in Russia. Okay, so vast majority of people still believe that, not so much other places. Maybe this is why Americans are reluctant to excuse people from their jobs. All 40 of the leading industrial nations provide some form of parental leave for new parents, except in the U.S. Now, again, that's old news. Most companies do nowadays. Men and women, by the way. America does not count itself among the more than 130 countries that have set up a maximum length of work week. In other words, we have no federal law that says you can only work so much. You can work as much as you want. You just got to get paid for it. Okay. See, that's the other thing where it changed. 4 years ago, we had that law where, you know what, you want to be an assistant manager at a restaurant, you can get paid $27,000 a year for a salary and still work 80 hours a week. They don't have that anymore. We've changed that. Yet Americans remain highly productive. Now, as measured by average contribution to the gross domestic product, American workers produce on the average $60.59 worth of goods and services every hour, the third largest rate among the 20 leading economic nations. That's according to a 2011 report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, this is consistent with tradition reaching back for generation upon generation. So if we're still putting in productive and long hours, why do we feel that our work ethic is slipping? Again, remember, this is from 2018. Now, it may have to do with the challenging nature of American work. The majority of hiring is taking place in the service industry, where wages are low and chances of advancement are few. Knowledge-based jobs like computer programming, they pay better, but they often require college degrees. Since 1988, the cost of a 4-year degree in public college has risen over 200%. The student loan debt has more than doubled to $1.3 trillion. That was in 2016. It's a lot more than that now. Meanwhile, wages have remained virtually unchanged. In 1964, the average hourly wage in America was $2.50. In 2014, it was $19.18. That's an impressive difference if you take inflation adjustments into those numbers. Those numbers show that workers are only earning $1.49 an hour more than they did 40 years ago when you take inflation into consideration. Now, that's more than almost 50% more, but that's another story for another day. Now, in addition to hours worked, company loyalty has also been seen as a marker for strong work ethic. But employee loyalty has eroded as companies have downsized their workforce, while some high-level CEOs are receiving multi-million-dollar perks as part of their employment or separation package. Again, the operative employee is just fired, and the big shots get the corporate parachutes. Okay? You can understand why company loyalty, especially in the big corporations, has slipped. But then they talk about millennials. What about millennials? Well, the criticism of the American worker has been even stronger when describing millennials. Again, those born between 81 and 96, 1981 and 1996. Business owners claim that they are hard to manage and don't apply themselves to the job. But here again, the statistics about their work habits and aspiration are contradictory. For example, back in 2010, a Pew Research Center survey asked over 2,000 workers in the silent generation, that's before World War II, baby boomers and Gen X's, what's most important in their lives. Most millennials, 52%, replied being a good parent. Having a high-paying career fell to 6th place. Now, when asked what qualities distinguish their generation, millennials were the only generation that didn't include work ethic on their list. Okay? So millennials are the first generation that didn't include work ethic as being important on their list. Now, other two surveys, though, gave a different picture of millennials. They talked about 5,600 full-time workers in the baby boom, Gen X, and millennial generations who had jobs with paid time off. They found that millennials worried most about taking time off and being replaced. More millennials, 48%, wanted to be viewed as work martyrs than Gen X's. And baby boomers, they also were more likely to leave paid vacations unused. So the millennials they're showing, they were kind of starting to fall in line as they got older, okay? Now, so what will the future of American workplace look like? This question was asked in 2018. What will it look like? Well, in 20 or 10 or 20 or even 100 years from now, will we all be working 80-hour weeks in a series strung together by part-time gig jobs and the gig economy, or will we find ourselves in a work-free haven, being served drinks by our robot butlers or overlords? Okay, well, that was an interesting story because that took place in 2018. Fast forward to today. Article from the Wall Street Journal talking about a guy named Michael Trotter. In the months before he left his last job back in 2020, Michael Trotter came to dread an end-of-day question from colleagues. That question, do you want to go out and grab a drink? Trotter said, I don't want to put in 8, 9, 10 hours, then go out and have a beer and talk about shop for another 4 hours. Now, many workers say that forging office friendships have become harder and less of a priority over the past 2 years, during which millions of working Americans changed jobs or work from home. It's tough to have a work buddy if you're working from home, right? After working more than 2 pandemic years, some professionals are also quiet quitting and making other moves to carve out more work-life balance. That includes cutting back on workplace socializing and bonding. In other words, at 5 o'clock, they're done. And it makes it a lot easier if after your work is done, then you're done. That's according to Trotter. In other words, if you're going to work 9 to 5, if you're truly working 9 to 5, that makes working 9 to 5 easier. If you got to work 9 to 5 and then go out and have drinks with buddies and talk about the workplace anyway, that doesn't make things easier. That makes the whole thing difficult. And I don't disagree with any of that. In fact, I think in some respects, in many respects, the Gen Z workers have a point. And I use the example, a couple of years ago, the trophy wife and I were on vacation, and we were staying at a hotel in Sacramento, California. Okay. And we're sitting at the pool enjoying just a beautiful evening. It was the day had been kind of hot, probably into the 90s, but low humidity. But as soon as that sun started to set, man, it got beautiful. In fact, almost chilly. Okay, the temperature dropped, a nice breeze came in. We were sitting by the pool, watching a Cardinal game on via the internet on a tablet, drinking a beer, just kicking back and relaxing, just enjoying life. And there were a group of guys. I went in to get a beer or something, and there were a group of guys sitting at the table. You just tell by the way they were dressed and by the way they were talking. This was a group of people. They weren't from there. They were on business. This is 8 o'clock at night, okay? And they're all huddled around a table. And one guy's leading them, the other guys are following. And they were in a heated discussion as to what color to put in the background of an ad they were putting together. Why? Let's make it green. No, we should make it blue. No, a lighter green than that. Yes. And I wanted to just shake them, saying, it's 8 o'clock at night. Stop it. Make it orange. Have a beer and chill out. I think that's what some of the Gen Zers are saying. I think a lot of them are saying, the 9 to 5 job isn't great, but it's a job. And it is 9 to 5. Okay. Don't make it 9 to 6 or 7 or 10 or answer emails in the middle of the night like many of us do. I get it. I understand that. In fact, once upon a time, when I first started in the sales business, that's what you did. You went out to lunch, you went out to dinner with customers. Few of my customers want to go out to dinner with me or even lunch. And it's not that they don't like me, but when the day is done, they want to go home to their families. They don't want to go out with the stupid salesman. Now, even when we go out, we almost never talk business, okay? Mainly because they don't want to. We talk business in the workplace. When we go out, we talk about sports or life or families or vacation or something like that. Because those customers who still want to go out, they don't want to talk about the job while they're out away from the job, okay? And a lot of people don't even want to see me, much less see me for lunch or dinner. I'll give you an example. Zoom calls, Microsoft Teams, whatever you want to call it, okay? That's a big way of communicating. This week alone, I sat in Zoom meetings, Microsoft Teams meetings, where you're looking at these people, and I had calls from, I talked to people in Indonesia, Singapore, Israel, Germany, Poland, North Carolina, and Kentucky. This week. Now, is that my week every week? No. but it was this week, and it is some weeks. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's bad, the way people are approaching their jobs now, the younger generation. But I will tell you this. It doesn't matter if it's good or if it's bad. It's the way things are. It's the way they're going to be. It's the way of the future, okay? For years and years, in fact, I was camping in the desert one time, and there was a French couple, a little younger than me, but not a ton. And I struck up a friendship with them and talking about them, and basically the French lady said, "You know what? I work in international business, and I work with a lot of Americans." She said, "I love Americans, but you have one major problem. You work too much." So my husband and I left France 6 weeks ago. We've been in this country for 6 weeks, just wandering around enjoying ourselves. Americans don't do that. Europeans do. Now, has France come to an end? No. Was that lady smiling a whole lot more than most Americans that I know? Yep. Is there a point to be made by taking a breath more often? Yep. Where will it go? Don't know. Can't tell you for sure. But what is for sure is that things are definitely changing. The future will tell if they're changing for the better, for the worse, or if we'll just be running in place. That's it. We're done. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's my email address. Send your email address to me. I will send you a link to the podcast upon your request. You can download it and listen to it at your leisure, or just pick up the podcast anywhere you pick up your podcasts. iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, you name it, it's there. Podcast resides at Spreaker.com. That's it. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.